Well, Robert Sachs rejoins the program today with his newest book, The Passionate Buddha, Wisdom on Intimacy and Enduring Love. It's an Inner Traditions 2002 release. You can find links to his website at www.futuretalk.org or at www.diamondwayayurveda.com or www.9stark.net. Robert, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Zoe. It's nice to be back with you again.
Well, you've written another beautiful book, and I thought it important, as you say in your own words, you're not an authority. You speak here as a practitioner. Tell us how you see the difference between the two.
I'm not a master. I'm not a lama. I'm a person that's been studying with lamas and masters for many, many years now. And I feel that it's important to distinguish, in many respects, the difference between a practitioner. I mean, all lamas and all masters are practitioners, but not all practitioners are obviously masters. And I certainly haven't mastered this one, that's for sure.
Why don't you, as you do the reader of your book, The Passionate Buddha, tell us the story of Siddhartha and how it really becomes the example of the journey all of us take if we choose to be open to the journey itself.
Well, I think what's interesting about it, with the story of Siddhartha, is that in the Tibetan tradition you have what are called namtar, which are sacred biographies. And in the process of telling sacred biographies, oftentimes what is left out are sort of like the more human aspects of what happens in the process of transformation. And to me, those are very, very important. In the case of Siddhartha, what you have is a situation of someone who essentially had everything going for him. And in fact, you would say that, I don't know if this would even be an appropriate thing to say, he's like the Tom Cruise of his day, so to speak.
Right.
He has everything going for him. He's got good looks. He's intelligent. He has a beautiful wife. He has a child that's born to him that is going to be an heir to the throne that he is supposed to be taking over from his father. And his father had spent a lot of time trying to protect him from the world, from the things that people should basically experience in everyday life. They experience birth, sickness, old age, and death, which are all around us all the time. But what happened in the case of Siddhartha is his family tried to isolate him from all those things which would indicate his mortality or would upset his mind. And what happened, though, was just by virtue of us growing up, we see that we change. And therefore, when we have everything around us presented as some kind of static, changeless situation, we think something is wrong. And Siddhartha definitely felt something was wrong. And so he snuck out. I mean, he basically rebelled against his parents. He decided to, in some ways, itch that scratch that was going on inside himself. And so what he did was he made several excursions outside of the palace that he lived in and began to encounter life as it really is.
And one of the things that is told by anybody who tells the story of Siddhartha is how he took the path of extremism in different ways of body, mind, and soul, becoming emaciated and starving himself and looking for enlightenment, but then realizing not only does extremism in the individual take you out of balance, but we see it in our society and its effect in our balance.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, right now I'm involved with a program that I've designed that has to do with the fact that we really have tried to obliterate those four markers of humanity. And that is, we've put birth behind closed doors, we don't talk about sickness, and we medicate every possible sickness. We certainly don't deal with old age. We stick old people behind closed doors. And we certainly don't talk about death. So what we do is we've actually created an extreme situation. And in those extreme situations, people do extreme things to feel their mortality. And in the case of Siddhartha, this is exactly what he had to do in some ways because of the extreme nature of his situation of being almost like in a palatial, impossible situation. He had to do something extreme to start with, and so he thought getting rid of everything was going to be the solution. But what really brought him to his senses and really brought him back into his body and brought him back into his humanity and the idea that his humanity could serve the spirit that he was for him to encounter a young lady who was she was tending to some cows. She saw this emaciated man on this river just sitting there looking at the water and offers him just a bowl of food. And if you look at all of the aspects of what's at play in the life of Siddhartha at that point, is you have the water, which is representative of the feminine. You obviously have the young cowherder, which is representative of the feminine. And she offers him basically some kheer, some rice and milk. And the milk is feminine, the rice is feminine, so it's resplendent with feminine aspect, with this feminine principle. And what happens is it's the wisdom of that gentleness that wakes him up to the reality that it shouldn't be too tight and it shouldn't be too loose. It actually helps him to understand what has essentially been called the middle way.
One of the hallmarks, of course, of all the mystic paths and spiritual disciplines that find their resolution in the heart is that love is the connector of all life and living.
Absolutely.
Beyond the quality of the unified field of light, there is the unified field of love.
And I think what's important about this, too, with this whole concept of love is that oftentimes we sanitize the word love like we sanitize the word compassion. I think that's especially true in spiritual circles when we talk about these principles. And I think it's very interesting that the Dalai Lama talks about the importance of human affection. And by virtue of using that word affection, he suddenly starts bringing into it a little bit more intimate sense to it. And I think that's so important. Otherwise, it becomes very rarefied.
Right, and it becomes like an object observing itself rather than a human being being present to another human being's joy or pain or whatever it is that presents itself at the moment. One of the things your book, The Passionate Buddha, speaks to is that the awakened heart helps us live in the moment. It's not like you deny your past or that you can escape necessarily the seeds that you've sown, but you approach it differently. And describe in what way?
I think what happens when you finally connect with your awakened heart is that you actually apply some compassion to yourself, some mercy to yourself. You begin to open up to something soft within yourself, which allows you to forgive as well as to move forward and to continue to act. There's a lot of different sayings that I put in the book. One of the quotes that I use is "first thought, best thought," which was a quote of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And in that concept of first thought, best thought, was not that your first thought is the absolute perfect, totally right thought, but if you really connect with things with your heart, and let's say you walk into a situation and you just feel the connection that's there, and you act upon that sensibility, it doesn't mean that that is ultimately the perfect thing to be doing. But if you try and second-guess yourself, if you try, well, obviously from a humanistic, psychological perspective, or from the ultimate Buddhist view, I should be doing this rather than that, what we do is we start having it so that we actually start being inauthentic to ourselves. And rather than learning through the process of how we connect with our heart, what we do is end up beating ourselves up based on principles that, sure, in the long run, we are trying to connect with, but in the short term, we have to realize that we have to start where we are.
One of the things that I see, and because I have the lovely, opportunity of reading so many beautiful books from so many spiritual disciplines, is that they all ultimately say the same thing. It's not about looking for an outcome, it's about conditioning the field of your own being, like cultivating the furrows in your heart and fertilizing it with right action, right thought, and right word. So I think what you've done in your book, Robert, The Passionate Buddha, Wisdom on Intimacy and Enduring Love, and what we're going to spend the next part of our conversation looking at is what you describe are the 4 key elements to enduring relationship. If you're just tuning in, I'm glad you're here. Robert Sachs is our guest. You can find his work, The Passionate Buddha, at futuretalk.org or 9starkeye.net.
Of us and this long era of developing the individual self is that we each have these unique gifts. But I have a sense, because of the work I've done, and that of how it all fits together to make, really an extraordinarily beautiful picture. And it is a picture of community.
Welcome to Future Talk. I'm Zohara Hieronymus, and sometimes we forget that we are in that community. The community is not outside of us. We actually think that our neighbor living in a separate house next door, and we can think what we want to think and that they aren't us. But the truth is we are all us. Thank you, Walt Kelly, so many years ago. Although I like to think of we have met the lover and they are us rather than we have met the enemy and they are us. Robert Sachs joins us today on Future Talk. His book, The Passionate Buddha, Wisdom on Intimacy and Enduring Love, is a really beautiful introduction to how to make Buddhism, the principles of Buddhism, regardless of your spiritual path or your religious affiliations. These are key principles I think that any human being benefits by. It's an Inner Tradition 2002 release. Several websites, www.diamond, D-I-A-M-O-N-D, way, W-A-Y, Ayurveda, AYURVEDA.com, or www.9stark, STARKI.net, and a phone number you can order directly from Inner Traditions, 1-800-246-8468, extension 111. That's 1-800-246-8468, extension 111. If you're hearing this on the weekend somewhere in the world, please wait till the workday. Robert, in your book, The Passionate Buddha, you make clear that there really are ways to look at a relationship, and you say that there's 4 key elements you've discovered that make for an enduring relationship.
Yes. Do you want me to go through those?
Would you please? Unless you'd like me to do it.
Okay. I think the 4 points I mention in the book are flexibility, personal detachment, mutuality, and basically a sense of universal love and compassion. And I maybe go through each one a little bit as I mention them in the book. In terms of flexibility, I think that once one begins to work with compassion and understanding and beginning to care for oneself, and some practices that begin to help open oneself up. And I'm talking about contemplative practices and meditative practice where you're, and especially in our culture where we really do not have any wisdom tradition that we connect with, going to a tradition where you can learn certain kinds of methods creates a kind of an openness, a kind of flexibility where the world doesn't seem so solid anymore. And I think the minute you have a situation in a relationship where you're no longer treating something as solid, or the situation or the difficulty that you're facing as a solid situation, there becomes a lot more playfulness in it. There becomes a lot more possibility. So I think that in any kind of enduring relationship, there's got to be that kind of flexibility. In terms of a personal detachment, I'm not necessarily meaning any kind of distancing. And oftentimes that's what happens when we talk about detachment. It seems like it's something rather cold. Rather, what it really has to do with is not taking our lives so seriously, not taking our lives so personally, not making the situation so solid in ourselves. And as we begin to do that, what happens is we can actually, as Stephen Levine talks about it, is not look at our pain, but the pain. We begin to understand that when we're suffering from jealousy, from anger, from any kind of negative emotion, that this is also something that as we begin to transform ourselves and we begin to show mercy and kindness and compassion to ourselves, it is also true that everyone around us, when they inflict us with any kind of difficulty or they challenge us in any way, really are coming out of trying to do the best they know how based on the information they've had. And as a result of that, if we look at them in that way, we begin to be able to work with the situation with a lot more detachment rather than taking everything so harshly.
We'll be right back for more with Robert Sachs on Future Talk.
Love is essentially, I think essentially it's not blind at all. Love is extraordinarily sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And it awakens our senses. It looks for objects. It isn't realized until it has some kind of goal, some kind of object.
Welcome to Future Talk. I'm Zohara Hieronymus. Joining us this portion of our program is Robert Sachs. His recent Inner Traditions 2002 release entitled The Passionate Buddha, Wisdom on Intimacy and Enduring Love. Again, don't forget all our shows are archived online at www.futuretalk.org and share them with others. Visit our daily newswire service and, of course, the archives from basically around the world as a result of our wonderful guest collaboration and their websites that are there. We were discussing the 4 key elements, as you do in your book, Robert, The Passionate Buddha. You had mentioned flexibility, personal detachment, and we have mutuality and a growing sense of universal love and compassion. Let's talk about the last 2.
With mutuality, I think that that's probably the absolute most essential one. I mean, no matter what you're going through, whether you're having a good day or a bad day, whether you are feeling totally in love or you have some degree of some kind of edge in the relationship for whatever reason, there's got to be a sense of mutuality where there's a respect for what the person's going through and they respect you, and essentially there's a willingness to sort of like go through it side by side as opposed to one person always being in command and the other person being subservient. In truth, what happens, though, is that there are times when we lead on the dance floor and sometimes we follow on the dance floor. Sometimes we're on top of our game and sometimes we're at the bottom of whatever we're experiencing. And so in many respects, it's always going to be an issue of where we really have a true sense of connection with the person that's with us. It's a very interesting statement that a very wise Buddhist teacher once said. His name was Gampopa. He said it's a sign of a superior person that they treat all with equanimity, yet still have a few good friends. And what he meant by that was that, yes, the mutuality is very important universally, and at the same time that mutuality can create a situation where you make a special connection with someone that actually is quite transformative, and it's in that mutuality. In many respects, what I look, for example, at is a lot of the promotion of things like tantric workshops and people getting together doing whatever they call tantra. Mm-hmm. And in many respects, what I've seen oftentimes come out of that are a lot of disappointed people simply because of the fact that they approach those situations without a sense of mutuality and at the same time a sense of mutual affection. It's kind of like, what can they get out of it? And you can't go into Tantra, you can't go into a really deep, loving relationship with wondering what you are going to get out of it.
Well, exactly. And then again, that was sort of what I mentioned in the beginning. Many people think that a spiritual practice is like, a fast food restaurant. You can, give them your order and you get it back out. But the truth is, it's the cultivation of your being as a field that allows these other states of consciousness to happen. You can't directly pursue elevated states of consciousness because you won't get it.
Well, actually, that's why, in fact, when you went in the introduction, when you were talking about, as opposed to the term that I used, fumbling to ecstasy, you said moving to ecstasy. Actually, I really believe that most of us fumble, and we fumble over ourselves. I mean, that's the stumbling blocks that are there are ours, and we might be moving, but at the same time, there's definitely times when you feel like you are jumping over hurdles and running into walls.
And we're jumping this hurdle of the moment. We'll be back. Nothing like a little leap in time and space. It's so easy in radio. Don't you all just do that when you meet the edge in your life? Sure, a little difficulty, you just jump. Well, that's what we're supposed to do. I think we have the ability to remember that going over the edge of something, it's one little tiny step. We all make this humongous supposition in our mind that it's a big leap and what's going to happen and what will this do to that and how will they feel and what will happen to our job or our relationship or the whatnot, when in fact it's one little step after another. Robert Sachs has written a wonderful guidebook, The Passionate Buddha, Wisdom on Intimacy and Enduring Love. It's an Inner Traditions 2002 release. Again, you can find a direct link in our guest forum at futuretalk.org. So when we look then, as you do, at this mutuality and the sense of growing universal love and compassion, you make a lot of suggestions about meditation, and I'd like to take some time today to talk about that. How do different meditations within your own practice differ from each other, and what kind, might be useful to our listening audience?
I think probably the simplest one to really look at is the first one I mentioned in the book, and that is just silent sitting practice. And it can be done in different ways. The way in which I suggested is working with the breath. There are other traditions that work with some kind of more external object of focus. But the purpose of it really is can you actually sit down with yourself and be comfortable with yourself? Can you just sit present and essentially not have it so that you have to think about what's going to happen next or what happened before? And you get rid of the future, you sort of block, or you get rid of the past as being a thing that you focus on. And all you do is try and relate to the moment through the breath, through whatever object you're looking at. And in that process, what happens is you usually find how much your mind is racing around. And the idea in this kind of meditation, which is called shamatha or peace, is to actually make it so that you actually, not only is it peacefulness from the standpoint of feeling a sense of peace, but also to some extent coming to peace with the present.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it's not only that peaceful feeling, but it's also making peace with yourself so that you can actually enjoy your own company. And then there's other ways of embellishing that. There's much deeper levels of transformation. Some of them have to do with our own personal meditations. And there are also what are called dual tantric meditations, which gets you into the whole dimension of sexuality and spirituality, which is very unexplored in our own culture.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, but I wanted to sort of stay for a moment on these forms of private meditation because you write, and I think well and clearly about, there's four thoughts that we have when we sit down to meditation. One is to observe the preciousness of our own life. Secondly,
Yes.
to see its impermanence. Third, to understand we reap what we sow. And fourthly, that we can commit ourselves to the loving nature inherent in human life.
These are considered the four thoughts that revolutionize the mind or turn the mind to spirituality. They're very, very potent in just sort of like helping us to basically arrive in the room that we're going to be meditating in.
Right. Well, and I think the story you tell and others who, Dr. Mark Epstein's written a wonderful book we're going to look at on Future Talk as well called Going on Being. Well, looking is the whole act. So we'll be
Yes.
back for more Looking in a Buddhist Way with Robert Sachs on Future Talk.
We forget that we live in a series of circles, and that if you're open and listening and watchful and do the right things, you will find great completion happening in your life.
Welcome to Future Talk. I'm Zohara Hieronymus at the voice of our prior guest, Nikki Arden. We've been joined today by Robert Sachs. He has written a wonderful book, The Passionate Buddha, Wisdom on Intimacy and Enduring Love. It's an Inner Traditions 2002 release. You can order an autographed copy by calling 877-964-1395. That's 877-964-1395. And you can find links to his different websites at www.futuretalk.org in the guest forum. Robert, I want to continue walking through so much of your book we're not going to get to today, but the issue of personal relationships, intimate relationships, marriages, families, co-workers, the use of energy to do something other than be used destructively.
Yes.
Describe for us one of the things I thought lovely. You said do something that makes you happy when you have anger. Use it to transmute it.
Well, I think one of the things that we look at in terms of our own Western psychological orientation is that when we have a problem, we're supposed to confront it head on. And sometimes what happens when we do that is we run into a wall that seems so solid, and then we're convinced that really what's going on is this must be an intractable problem between us and our beloved or whoever it is, and therefore this is a real wall that can never be gotten over, and that's going to be the end of the situation. And in many respects, from an Eastern standpoint, what they look at is that we have other strengths, we have other qualities that we can accentuate, we can work with to make it so that when we approach these more difficult ones, we actually can expand our ability to handle it with greater flexibility. In the case of anger, oftentimes, there's a very old saying that a friend of mine used to use. He says, if you want to look at the value of working with anger directly, or acting on our anger, or sort of like working
through our anger from the standpoint of exploring it very deeply. He says, look at an old psychotherapist and look at an old Buddha. And what he was trying to get at in that was that in many respects, we have to acknowledge the anger that is there, but then we need to have the skill to be able to work around and soften it rather than necessarily break through it in any kind of harsh way. So in the case of anger that you bring up, oftentimes teachers have suggested, listen, when the things are so hot and so intense that they seem so solid, the best thing to do is to take a break or to do something that is lovely, something that is going to uplift the mind. In the story that I have in the book, it's an incident between myself and my wife very early on in our marriage where it really was an intractable situation. It was a way in which both of us used to approach certain kinds of habit patterns. And at one point, just because of the spaciousness that meditation afforded me, I realized that it was much better to take that energy and use it in a much more productive way. So we went out to dinner.
Right, right. Let's not fight. How about dinner? Well, I thought it important because we see it in the world. We get it into these patterns of relationship, and the other becomes the obstruction in our mind and heart when in fact it's our own obstructing of our own self, not being able to turn in a new way to their energy. And so it's an opportunity really for change if you look at obstacles and opportunity. I'd like to, because so much of your book towards the end deals with sexuality and couples and their relationship, both heterosexual and homosexual, from a spiritual part. And I thought it important because you put to rest this issue. It's not about judging homosexuality. It's that energetically, same-sex sex cannot do the same kind of circuitry elevation that happens in heterosexuality.
Yeah, there's no judgment in it at all with respect to the rightness or wrongness or the goodness or the evilness of it or anything like that at all. Homosexuality is considered to be a karmic pattern that's there. I mean, it's been expressed by one Zen master Sung Sung. He talked about this. And what we're looking at in the book really is the idea that many of the teachings of Tantra were based on the movement of energy in a certain way. And when you do same-sex sex, it just doesn't have the same effect. It doesn't mean that you can't have loving intimacy. Absolutely not. But when we're talking about the kind of psychic circuitry and that kind of transformation that is inherent in tantric sex and tantric spiritual sexuality, that's a different matter.
Well, and I thought one of the things, and we've talked about this to some degree with some of the different shamans who have joined us, and it's certainly a long-honored process of being with a loved one from a distance. And I think it's important because so many people spend time apart across the world, or even because their travel's involved in their career. Maybe you can describe what that exercise is and how people can go about beginning to practice it with those that they care for.
Well, I think to some extent what has to happen is to recognize the sense of separation. I think oftentimes when we get that kind of distance away from each other, away from our loved ones, what ends up happening is that as we find ourselves interacting in the world at a distance from them, there's so much more stimulation, which could be other people, or it could just be the situations we find ourselves in, and then we begin to feel like we're missing our connection or we're losing something. And in some ways, it's like acknowledging that, yeah, we wish we could be together, and no, what's happening is I have to deal with the energy that's in front of me right now, the situation that's right in front of me, which has nothing to do with the sense of separation from my beloved, really. It has to do with me dealing with my world here and now. And so I think we need to separate that out. And then in the book, I actually have a meditation, which essentially is looking, I wouldn't even call it a meditation, it's more of a visualization that a person can do where when you sit down to meditate, try to really feel the presence of your partner with you. For one thing, energetically or in terms of the mind being faster than light, that's actually true. That we actually can be in the presence of our beloved anywhere we are at any time. That's one thing. And then there are more direct ways of doing that. I talk about a visualization which certainly isn't a standard visualization, but one which one can do where you can imagine that you're in an embrace with your partner and feel like the energy is circulating between the two. And I've seen practices like that, whether it be where you're imagining that you are in some kind of sexual union, or if you're just basically feeling the presence of your partner, where actually when you get on the phone or you write a letter to your partner, they may have felt that same sense of connection at that very moment.
Some of the other things that we can just touch on is the way you say to, and people always think, I want to avoid those things that are difficult. I want to avoid that person. I want to avoid that situation. And you, in fact, from a Buddhist perspective, say, why not go where the karma is strongest? Explain why and what you mean.
Well, in many respects, oftentimes in a relationship, two people have separate dreams. And, you love each other dearly, and at the same time you have goals or aspirations that you're interested in. And what ends up happening is this becomes a great blocking. What ends up happening is like a battle of wills. And the teacher that I worked with for years, Kempo Karcha Rinpoche, who lives in upstate New York, when he said go where the karma is strongest, is really looking at a situation where you see whose desire or whose interest is so strong that if they didn't fulfill that, it would really sort of like break their heart or make it so that their lives really couldn't move forward. And is it possible for us literally to step back a little bit, look at ourselves and say, okay, I can extend myself and open up to the dream of my partner, or it might be vice versa. And what happens is nothing is really ever lost in that situation. It's just a question of recognizing that if you really cherish each other, sometimes you just have to essentially maybe put something on the back burner and just go forward with the other person's dream and recognize its value. And then what happens is as the other person opens up and matures and grows and learns from that situation, you learn more about them, you learn more about yourself, and eventually, if that dream of yours was important, the time will probably come up anyway.
You point out that mending bridges, and you talked about the example with your wife in that sort of obnoxious pattern of volley sometimes a relationship will get in. What do you do to break it? Well, we see this in the world. So maybe we could return back to your discussion of passionate visualization, because I think it is something that everybody in the audience could practice, can practice, and will benefit by.
I think in many respects, yeah, I do. And in terms of working with people that you have difficulties with, even if it's not the passion visualization, for example, you might not want to visualize yourself being in sexual union with somebody that you have a real difficult time with. Okay, that's certainly not the situation that I would use that kind of visualization.
Right,
But the
and I
idea
wasn't
of
suggesting
feeling,
that. Yeah.
let's say that you're with somebody that you have a real difficult time with. And what they talk about is visualizing that all women or all females that you're having difficulty would be on your left, and all males that you would be having difficulty with you see on your right. And this could be a world leader. It could be someone in the world that's causing a tremendous amount of difficulties in the world. And you see them, if you're trying to sit quietly and meditate and just see your own mind becoming still and peaceful, imagine that person being with you, being present with you, and allowing that also to be the case.
I want to thank you, Robert, for being with us again in your beautiful work, The Passionate Buddha, Wisdom on Intimacy and Enduring Love. You can call 1-800-246-8648. We'll be back for more on Future Talk.
Part in Future Talk now at www.futuretalk.org.
Welcome to Future Talk. I'm Zohara Hieronymus. You can't ever do justice to the author's works that we discuss on Future Talk, and I really hope you understand that it's meant to be a sampling of their work. So if you have an interest in meditation, or you have an interest in trying to go deeper within yourself to find greater peace and to really to birth yourself. I think the beauty of Buddhism and the wonderful opportunity the Western world is having in being introduced to the principles of Buddhism, as Robert Sachs' book, The Passionate Buddha, points out, is that it's not something that requires any religious commitment. It requires a mindfulness about our humanness, about our innocence, about our capacity to love ourselves and each other. And as I'm learning, I guess is the way everybody who decides that the way to the heart is the path they choose, once you do that, your life begins to change quite dramatically. You begin to appreciate how you get in the way of the love flowing into your own life and in your relationships with others. And the getting quieter and the settling down and stopping the judging, or what they call the monkey chatter, and having a practice even, and folks, this does not require zazen. You don't have to sit for hours of disciplined practice. Take 10 minutes a day, either at the beginning of your day or the end of the day or the middle of the day, but make it regular, consistent, every day at the same time for a couple of months, where you just allow yourself to be present to the moment of doing nothing. And you can do a watchful meditation of your breathing. You just watch your breath come in and you count your breath going out and you watch your breath and that gives your mind something to focus. Of course, you'll see the mind running here and there and thinking about your errands and this relationship and who said what and you haven't done this and wonder if this was, what's on your list today. And you bring yourself back to your breath. And eventually the mind becomes very comfortable with quiet. And then the more of us who continually create that, it's like conditioning the field of your own consciousness, we create a receptive bowl within our own consciousness that can receive, I wouldn't call it information, I'd say enlightenment, a form of wisdom each day, a little bit of how to do the next step in your own life. So after you learn how to have a quieter mind, just a couple of minutes, 10 minutes a day, you can then start to incubate that time and ask for insight and specific guidance, and we do receive it. So the Passionate Buddha is a beautiful exploration of meditation, love, individual, as well as for couples and groups, and I encourage you to get it from Inner Traditions by calling 1-800-246 8648. And remember, whatever it is, if we do it, it will happen. So let's infuse it with love.